What does a plague doctor's mask have in common with the lock screen on your phone? What ties the hands of a Roman emperor to a Victorian widow's jet black brooch, or the shaven head of a medieval monk to a photograph of a deceased child? Consider the cough that emptied Athens, the sharp bite of a Latin psalm muttered by slaves in chains, the black ink of a Renaissance scribe tracing a skull beside a saint. Consider Shakespeare, who gave a fool a skull to hold, and in that hollow gaze found the whole of human vanity. Consider the glint of armor on a Roman general, marching in triumph, while a servant whispered in his ear that he was, after all, only mortal. These are not separate histories, they are the same quiet conversation, held across millennia. It is the whisper in the ear of a pharaoh, carved into the stone of a pyramid. It is the solemn rule of a monk, waking each morning to imagine his own end. It is the stiff-backed pose of a queen, mourning her husband for 40 years, turning grief into an empire's fashion. It is the software designer who, in a moment of dark pragmatism, added a feature to help you remember your own impermanence, right there in your palm. It is the mud of trenches, swallowing an entire generation. It is the camera, aimed at a dead child in the parlor, a beloved face captured because it was the only face they would ever have. From the Buddha, sitting beneath the Bodhi tree, contemplating the inevitable decay of the body, to the Stoic in a cold room, rehearsing the loss of everything he loves. This is the thread. These are all fingerprints on the same ancient artifact, memento mori. A Latin phrase, yes, but an instinct far older than Latin. It simply means, remember you will die. But it is not a morbid command. It is an invitation. Across centuries in cathedrals and tenements, in poetry and silent prayer, in the jewels we wear and the apps we swipe, human beings have been trying to answer the same question. How does the certainty of an ending give shape, meaning, and even beauty to the life lived in between? This is the story of that conversation. It is a story about the dead, but it is really a story about how the living have learned to hold them close, and in doing so, learned how to live. The complete history of Memento Mori. A deep dive into humanity's enduring reminder of death. Act 1. The Ancient Origins. Circa 3000 before the Common Era through 1st century of the Common Era. Chapter 1. The First Whispers. Imagine a banquet hall in ancient Egypt, circa 1500 before the Common Era. The food is exquisite, the wine flows freely, the laughter is abundant, but circulating among the guests is a servant, tasked with a peculiar duty. As each person reaches the height of their revelry, the servant approaches, holding aloft a small wooden coffin containing a crude wooden effigy of a corpse. The servant looks each reveler in the eye and utters a single phrase.
Look upon this figure, then eat and drink and be merry, for when you die, such shall you be.
This is the earliest recorded practice of what would later be called memento mori, a Latin phrase that did not yet exist, though the concept was already ancient. The Greek historian Herodotus documented this Egyptian custom in the 5th century before the Common Era, expressing wonder at a tradition that used the reminder of death to enhance the experience of life. The Egyptians were preoccupied with death, but not in the manner commonly assumed. Their civilization built itself around the premise that death was not an end, but a transition. The pyramids, the elaborate burial rituals, the mummification process, all of these prepared the soul for its journey to the afterlife. Yet alongside this elaborate preparation existed a parallel tradition, the carpe diem philosophy that emerged precisely because death was inevitable. We find this in Egyptian poetry, particularly in The Song of the Harper, a text from the tomb of King Intef, dating to approximately 2000 before the Common Era. Make holiday, and weary not therein. Behold, it is not given to any man to take his goods with him. Behold, none who departs returns again. This is the essential paradox of memento mori. The reminder of death is not meant to depress, but to liberate. The Egyptians understood this intuitively. The servant with the coffin was not trying to ruin the party, he was trying to make the party matter. The Greeks inherited Egyptian influence through trade and cultural exchange, transforming it into something more systematically philosophical. The Greek concept of thanatos, death, was personified as twin brother to hypnos, sleep, gentle, inevitable, and not inherently evil. But the Greeks also developed the first comprehensive philosophical treatments of death's relationship to life. Herodotus, witnessing the Egyptian banquet practice, wrote about it with wonder, recognizing that this ritual contained wisdom his own culture could use. Greek culture would soon develop its own versions. The most dramatic Greek expression of memento mori came not from philosophers but from warriors. When a Persian messenger demanded that the Spartans surrender their weapons at Thermopylae, King Leonidas reportedly responded with two words, molon labe, come and take them. This was not merely bravado. It was a statement rooted in the acceptance that death was preferable to dishonor. The Spartans knew they would die. That knowledge did not paralyze them. It freed them to fight with absolute commitment. Chapter 2. The Philosophers of Death. The first great philosophical treatment of death in Western thought comes from Socrates, who had the unique advantage of being able to philosophize about mortality while facing his own execution. In Plato's Apology, Socrates delivers what may be the most famous memento mori statement ever recorded. To fear death, gentlemen, is no other than to think oneself wise when one is not, for it is to think one knows what one does not know. No one knows whether death may not be the greatest of all blessings for a man, yet men fear it as if they knew that it is the greatest of evils. This is a radical reframing. Socrates is not merely saying, remember you will die. He is saying, remember that you do not actually know what death means, so stop acting as if you do. This uncertainty about death becomes the foundation for living well. If one cannot know what comes after, the only rational approach is to focus on what can be known, the quality of life in the present moment. The Stoics took this Socratic insight and built an entire practical philosophy around it. For the Stoics, memento mori was not an occasional reminder, but a daily spiritual exercise. Seneca, the Roman Stoic philosopher, wrote extensively on this in his letters to Lucilius. In one particularly striking passage, he advises, let us prepare our minds as if we had come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's accounts every day. The greatest flaw in life is that it is always imperfect, and that a certain part of it is postponed. One who daily puts the finishing touches to their life is never in want of time. Seneca practiced what he preached. He would periodically conduct what he called mental rehearsals of his own death, imagining himself on his deathbed, reviewing his life, asking whether he had lived well. This was not morbid rumination, but a tool for aligning daily actions with deepest values. Epictetus, the former slave who became one of Stoicism's greatest teachers, took a more direct approach. He advised his students that every time they kissed their child or embraced their spouse, they should whisper to themselves, tomorrow you will die. Not because they wished for death, but because this awareness would make every moment of love more precious, more fully experienced. Perhaps the most powerful Stoic expression of memento mori comes from Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, writing in his private journal, what is now called the Meditations. He writes,
You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think.
and elsewhere,
Do not act as if you had 10,000 years to live. The deadly hanging over you. While you live, while you can, be good.
Marcus was writing this to himself, not for publication. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he required this reminder daily. The awareness of death was his antidote to the corruptions of power, the distractions of empire, the endless petty concerns that could consume an emperor's attention. The Epicureans, Stoicism's great philosophical rivals, held a surprisingly complimentary view of death. Epicurus himself famously argued that death is nothing to us. because when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we do not exist. This sounds like a denial of memento mori, but it is actually a different route to the same destination. Epicurus believed that the fear of death was the single greatest source of human anxiety, and that by rationally understanding that death meant non existence, and therefore no sensation, no pain, no experience of any kind, humans could free themselves from that fear. The Epicurean practice was to meditate on this truth until it became instinctive. The goal was the same as the Stoics, to live fully in the present, unburdened by anxiety about the future. The method was simply different. Chapter 3: Roman Practice. The Romans, ever practical, took Greek philosophical concepts and transformed them into concrete cultural practices. The phrase memento mori itself is Latin, though it was not actually used as a fixed phrase until later. The Romans would have said something like memento te mortalem esse, remember that you are mortal. The most famous Roman embodiment of memento mori was the triumph. When a victorious general paraded through the streets of Rome with his soldiers, his captives, his spoils of war, riding in a golden chariot with a slave holding a laurel wreath over his head, that slave had another duty as well. As the crowds cheered and the general basked in his moment of supreme glory, the slave would whisper in his ear,
Respice post te, hominem te memento. Look behind you. Remember that you are a man.
This was not merely a reminder of mortality, it was a reminder of humility. In the moment of greatest human achievement, the Romans thought it essential to remember that one was not a god, that death would come, that this glory was fleeting. The Romans also incorporated memento mori into domestic life. In wealthy Roman homes, it was common to have mosaics or paintings depicting skulls or skeletons, often accompanied by the phrase carpe diem, seize the day. The two ideas were inseparable. The most famous archaeological example is the skeleton mosaic from Pompeii, which shows a skeleton holding two wine jugs with the inscription, Enjoy life while you live, for tomorrow is uncertain. Even Roman dining practices reflected this. The historian Suetonius records that at banquets, especially during the later empire, it became fashionable to have small silver skeletons passed among the guests, much like the Egyptian practice with the wooden coffin. The message was the same: eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Act 2: The Medieval Transformation, circa 400 through 1400 of the Common Era. Chapter 4: Death Becomes Sacred. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the rise of Christianity, the meaning of memento mori transformed. The pagan reminders of death had been about seizing the day, about living fully in the present because the future was uncertain. The Christian reminder of death was about preparing the soul for judgment. This shift was profound. Death was no longer merely an end, it was a beginning. It was the moment when the soul would be weighed, judged, and assigned to heaven, hell, or purgatory. This made the contemplation of death not just wise, but necessary for salvation. The early church fathers developed this theme extensively. Saint Jerome, in the 4th century, wrote,
Whether you eat or drink, do all as if you were about to die. Whether you sleep or watch, do all as if you were about to die. Whether you are at home or on a journey, do all as if you were about to die.
The most influential medieval text on this subject was Thomas à Kempis's The Imitation of Christ, written in the early 15th century but reflecting centuries of monastic tradition. Always keep death daily before your eyes. Blessed is the man who always has the hour of death before his eyes, and daily prepares himself to die. This was not about fear, or rather, it was about what they called a holy fear, a fear that would motivate right living. The monastic tradition developed elaborate practices of death meditation. Monks would dig their own graves and sleep in them. They would keep skulls in their cells. They would recite the office of the dead daily. All of this was training for what they believed was the most important moment of existence, the moment of death and judgment. By the 15th century, this focus on death had become so central to Christian practice that a new literary genre emerged, the Ars Moriendi, or the art of dying. These were guidebooks, often illustrated, that taught Christians how to die well. The original Ars Moriendi was written around 1415 by an anonymous Dominican friar, probably in response to the trauma of the Black Death and the social upheavals of the late medieval period. It became an instant bestseller, translated into most European languages and distributed widely. The book was structured around 6 chapters: the praise of death and the importance of dying well, the temptations that assail the dying, lack of faith, despair, impatience, pride, and attachment to worldly things, how to overcome these temptations, questions to ask the dying person, prayers and exhortations for the dying, and instructions for after death. What is remarkable about the Ars Moriendi is its practical, almost clinical approach to death. It treats dying as a skill to be learned, a performance to be mastered. The good death was a death where the dying person remained conscious, aware, and prayerful until the very end, resisting the temptations of the devil and commending their soul to God. The illustrated versions of the Ars Moriendi are particularly striking. They show the deathbed as a battlefield, with angels and demons fighting over the soul of the dying person. The dying person's ability to remain faithful in their final moments determines the outcome. This is memento mori, raised to cosmic significance. Chapter 5. The Dance of Death. Perhaps the most famous artistic expression of medieval memento mori is the dance macabre, or dance of death. This theme emerged in the late 14th century, again in the aftermath of the Black Death, which had killed between one-third and one-half of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351. The Dance of Death was an allegorical representation of death's universality. It showed skeletons or corpses leading people from all walks of life, pope, emperor, king, peasant, child, scholar, in a dance toward the grave. The message was unmistakable. Death comes for everyone, regardless of status or wealth. The first known example was a mural painted in the cemetery of the Holy Innocents in Paris in 1424 through 1425, though it was destroyed in the 17th century. But the theme spread rapidly. Surviving examples exist in churches and cemeteries across Europe, in Lübeck, Germany, in Tallinn, Estonia, in Bærum, Croatia, in London, England. What made the Dance of Death so powerful was its combination of horror and humor. Death was often depicted as playful, even mischievous, tricking people into joining the dance. The accompanying texts, usually in verse, gave voice to each character. The Pope says,
I am the Holy Father, Lord of all the world, yet death has come to seize me by the hair. My crown and keys are worthless here. I must join this dance, like any common soul.
and the peasant says, I worked hard all my life, with calloused hands and aching back. Now death has come to end my strife, and I will never more lack. I dance with joy, not sorrow, for I have nothing left to borrow. This leveling aspect of the dance of death was profoundly subversive. In a society built on rigid hierarchies, the reminder that death makes all equal was a powerful message. It could be read as consolation for the poor: your suffering is temporary, and in death you will be equal to the rich, or as warning to the rich: your wealth will not save you, so use it wisely. Chapter 6. The Physical Reminders. The medieval world was filled with physical reminders of death. Every church had its charnel house, where bones were stacked and displayed. Every cemetery was a gathering place, where people walked among the dead daily. Every funeral was a public spectacle, with the body carried through the streets, surrounded by mourners, accompanied by the tolling of bells. The most personal and intimate memento mori objects were the ones people carried with them. The skull was the ultimate symbol of death, and it appeared everywhere. Monks kept real skulls in their cells. Wealthy patrons commissioned paintings of themselves contemplating skulls. Prayer books, called hooray or books of hours, often included images of skulls or skeletons. The most famous example is the Hours of Mary of Burgundy, a 15th century illuminated manuscript that shows the Duchess at prayer, and in the margin a skeleton stands with an arrow, reminding her of death's sudden arrival. By the late medieval period, people began wearing jewelry designed to remind them of death. Rings engraved with skulls, brooches shaped like coffins, pendants containing miniature skeletons. These were not morbid fashion statements. They were spiritual tools, worn to keep death constantly in mind. One common design was the memento mori ring, often inscribed with phrases like, "Remember you must die," or "Live to die, die to live." Some rings had hinged lids that opened to reveal a tiny skeleton or skull inside. Wearing such a ring meant carrying death on one's finger, always visible, always present. Perhaps the most dramatic medieval memento mori was the transi tomb, or cadaver tomb. These were elaborate funerary monuments that showed the deceased in two forms. On top, they appeared as in life, often in full regalia, but below, through an open shroud, they appeared as a rotting corpse, often with worms and decay visible. The earliest surviving example is the tomb of Cardinal Jean de Lagrange in Avignon from 1402. But the most famous is the tomb of Henry Chichele, Archbishop of Canterbury, who died in 1443. On top, Chichele lies in full archbishop's regalia. Below, his naked, emaciated corpse lies on a shroud. The inscription reads,
I was a pauper born, then primate here. Now I am cut down, and food for worms. Behold my tomb. Whoever you may be, you will surely be like me.
These tombs were not meant to be morbid, they were meant to be honest. They reminded the living that beneath all the robes and titles, beneath all the achievements and honors, all are simply flesh that will rot. And in that honesty they hoped the living would find wisdom. Act 3. The Renaissance and Baroque Flourishing, circa 1400 through 1700 of the Common Era. Chapter 7. Art Meets Mortality. The Renaissance transformed memento mori just as it transformed everything else. The medieval focus on death as spiritual preparation gave way to a more complex understanding, one that balanced the fear of death with the celebration of life, the certainty of decay with the beauty of the moment. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Dutch and Flemish painters developed a new genre of still life painting called vanitas. The name comes from the Latin phrase from Ecclesiastes, vanitas vanitatum, omnia vanitas, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Vanitas paintings were elaborate, still lifes filled with symbols of mortality and the transience of worldly pleasures. A typical vanitas might include a skull, certain death, a guttering candle or hourglass, time running out, fresh flowers often with petals falling, beauty that fades, bubbles, the fragility of life, musical instruments, pleasures that do not last, books and scientific instruments, knowledge that cannot save, coins and jewelry, wealth that cannot buy immortality, and overripe or rotting fruit, decay that comes to all things. These paintings were immensely popular in the Dutch Republic, a society that had become wealthy through trade and was struggling with the moral implications of that wealth. The vanitas tradition allowed people to enjoy their luxuries while simultaneously acknowledging their emptiness. One could have one's cake and contemplate its decay at the same time. Peter Klaas was the master of this genre. His Vanitas still life from 1630 shows a skull tilted toward the viewer, its empty eye sockets staring out. Beside it rests an overturned glass, an extinguished oil lamp, a pocket watch. Every object conveys the same message: time is running out. The most complex Vanitas paintings do not merely remind of death, they also remind of life's value. The very beauty of the painting, the skill required to render a silver platter or a velvet cloth, celebrates human achievement, even as it warns against taking that achievement too seriously. The single most famous Renaissance memento mori image appears in Hans Holbein the Younger's 1533 painting, The Ambassadors. The painting shows two wealthy, powerful men surrounded by symbols of their achievements, scientific instruments, books, musical instruments, globes. They stand at the height of their powers, masters of the known world. Yet stretched across the bottom of the painting, completely inexplicable at first glance, is a strange, elongated shape. To discern what it is, the viewer must stand to the side of the painting, looking at it from an oblique angle. And then, suddenly, the shape resolves into a human skull. Holbein has hidden death in plain sight. From straight on, the ambassadors see only their own glory. But if they shift their perspective, if they look at life from a different angle, they see the skull. And the viewer, standing in the gallery, must literally move to see it, becoming part of the painting's message. We, too, must shift our perspective to see death. And once we see it, we see the ambassadors differently. Their power, their knowledge, their wealth, all of it is framed by the skull at their feet. This is memento mori as visual puzzle, as philosophical statement, as artistic masterpiece. It contains the entire tradition within a single image. Chapter 8. The Poets of Mortality. The Renaissance also produced the greatest poetry of mortality in the English language. John Donne, the 17th century metaphysical poet and later dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, was deeply engaged with death. His holy sonnets grappled directly with mortality, most famously in Sonnet 10. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou think'st thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. This is the Christian memento mori transformed into defiance. Donne does not merely accept death, he taunts it. Death itself will die, Donne argues, when the faithful are resurrected. The skull is not the end, but a transition. Donne also provided one of the most personal memento mori in literary history. In his final weeks, as he lay dying, he had a portrait painted of himself wearing his funeral shroud, standing on a funeral urn. He kept this portrait in his bedroom, gazing at it as he approached death. After his death, a statue was carved based on this portrait, and it survives today in St. Paul's Cathedral. Donne wrapped in his shroud, standing in his own funeral monument facing eternity. Shakespeare returned to mortality repeatedly. In Hamlet, the graveyard scene is perhaps the most famous memento mori in all of literature. Hamlet holds the skull of Yorick, the court jester he knew as a child, and reflects, "Alas, poor Yorick! I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now, how abhorred in my imagination it is! My gorge rises at it. Here hung those lips that I have kissed I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table on a roar?" Hamlet is doing what memento mori asks. He is looking at death and seeing life. Yorick's skull triggers memories of the living man, his jokes, his songs, his warmth. The skull is not merely a symbol of death, but a trigger for appreciating life. Shakespeare then extends the meditation. Hamlet asks the gravedigger whose skull this might have been, a lawyer, a courtier, a land speculator, and he realizes that all the schemes and ambitions of the living come to nothing in the face of death. The lawyer's fine points of law, the courtier's flattery, the land speculator's deeds and titles, all become meaningless when the skull is all that remains. Chapter 9. The Plague Years. The 17th century brought memento mori from philosophy to lived reality in the most visceral way possible. The bubonic plague returned to Europe with devastating force. London's Great Plague of 1665 killed approximately 100,000 people, nearly a quarter of the city's population. Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, written decades later but based on careful research, captures how the plague transformed daily life into a constant memento mori. The streets were empty and the houses shut up, and the few people that stirred abroad walked in the middle of the streets, for fear of infection. The grass grew in the churches, and the bells tolled continually. The dead carts went about every night, and the cry was, "Bring out your dead." In such an environment, one needed no skull on the desk to remember death. Death was everywhere. It was in the air breathed, the water drunk, the clothes touched. Every cough was a potential sentence. Every ache could signal the beginning of the end. The plague year produced its own literature of mortality. Broadsides and pamphlets circulated, many with crude woodcuts showing skeletons mowing down the living like wheat. Sermons thundered about God's judgment. Diaries recorded the daily toll. It also produced the most famous plague literature of all, the Ring Around the Rosy nursery rhyme, which many believe originated in this period. Ring around the rosy referred to the red spots that were the first sign of plague. Pocketful of posies referred to the herbs people carried to ward off infection. Ashes, ashes referred to the cremation of bodies. And we all fall down referred to death itself. While folklorists debate the precise origins of the rhyme, its association with the plague has become deeply embedded in popular memory. Act 4, the Victorian Climax. Circa 1837 through 1901 of the Common Era. Chapter 10, the Cult of Death. The Victorians took memento mori and transformed it into an entire culture. No society before or since has been so thoroughly engaged with death. Yet Victorian death culture was distinct from what came before, more sentimental, more domestic, more focused on the emotional experience of grief than on the philosophical contemplation of mortality. The catalyst for much of this was Queen Victoria herself. When her beloved husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861 at the age of 42, Victoria's grief was all-consuming. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life. She had Albert's room preserved exactly as it was on the day he died, with hot water brought in every morning and fresh linen laid out every night. She commissioned countless memorials, statues, and portraits. The Queen's very public grief set the tone for the nation. Mourning became fashionable, it became elaborate, it became a performance. Victorian mourning was governed by an elaborate code of etiquette that would have been incomprehensible to earlier generations. There were rules for everything: how long to wear mourning for different relatives, 2.5 years for a spouse, 1 year for a parent, 6 months for a grandparent, 3 months for an aunt or uncle, what kind of clothing to wear during each stage of mourning, deep mourning, second mourning, half mourning, what fabrics were acceptable, crepe for deep mourning, silk and wool for later stages, what jewelry could be worn, jet, onyx, or hair jewelry, and how to behave in society: no parties, no theater, no dancing during deep mourning. These rules served multiple purposes. They provided structure for the grieving, a clear path through the chaos of loss. They signaled to society the depth of one's grief and the respect one held for the deceased, and they created a booming industry for mourning goods, clothing, jewelry, funeral supplies, memorial art. The most striking, and to modern eyes, most disturbing, Victorian memento mori practice was post-mortem photography. When someone died, especially a child, it became common to have a photograph taken of the body. These photographs are haunting. The deceased is often posed as if sleeping, sometimes with eyes painted open on the print. In family portraits, the dead child might be held by the mother or seated in a chair with siblings standing around. The living and the dead appear together, captured in the same image. For families who had no photographs of their loved ones in life, these post-mortem images were the only record. They were treasured possessions, kept in albums, displayed in parlors. They were, in the most literal sense, memento mori, reminders that this person had died and that the viewer would also die. Some photographers specialized in post-mortem work. They developed techniques for making the dead appear as lifelike as possible. They would sometimes photograph the body before rigor mortis set in, allowing for more natural poses. They would arrange flowers around the body, place the deceased in favorite clothing, surround them with treasured objects. Modern viewers often find these photographs morbid, even grotesque. But for the Victorians, they were expressions of love. They were ways of keeping the dead present, of refusing to let death have the final word. The photograph declared, "This person existed. This person was loved. This person will not be forgotten." Chapter 11: Hair, Jewelry, and the Material Culture of Mourning. The Victorians took material reminders of death further than any previous culture. They created an entire industry of objects designed to keep the dead close. The most intimate of these objects was hair jewelry. Locks of hair from the deceased were woven into intricate patterns and set in rings, brooches, lockets, and watch chains. The hair of multiple family members might be combined into a single piece, creating a tangible connection between the living and the dead. Hair jewelry had existed before the Victorians. Examples survive from the 17th century, but the Victorians elevated it to an art form. Professional hair workers developed techniques for braiding, weaving, and arranging hair into elaborate designs. Instructional manuals were published. Kits were sold for those who wished to make their own. The symbolism was powerful. Hair was part of the person, yet it survived death. It could be touched, held, worn against the skin. It was a physical connection to the lost loved one, a way of keeping them present in the most literal sense. Queen Victoria herself wore hair jewelry containing Albert's hair. She had several pieces made, and she wore them for the rest of her life. When she was buried, she wore Albert's dressing gown and a ring containing his hair. Beyond hairwork, the Victorians produced vast quantities of mourning jewelry. Jet, a hard, black fossilized wood, was the preferred material. It could be carved into intricate shapes and polished to a high shine. The finest jet came from Whitby in Yorkshire, and Whitby jet became a global commodity. Mourning rings were often commissioned by the deceased themselves to be distributed to friends and family after death. These rings might be inscribed with the name and date of death, along with a message, "Prepared be to follow me," or "Not lost but gone before." Other materials used in mourning jewelry included onyx, black enamel, vulcanite, an early plastic, and gutta percha, a natural latex. Each carried its own symbolic meaning and practical advantages. The Victorians also produced countless other memento mori objects. Memorial cards were printed and distributed at funerals, featuring religious imagery and the details of the deceased. These were kept in albums or displayed in the home. Sewn pictures, called mourning samplers, were created by women to commemorate lost loved ones. These might include the name and date of death, along with weeping willows, funeral urns, and other symbols of mourning. Even furniture participated in the culture of mourning. Mourning chairs were sometimes used only during periods of bereavement. Some chairs had seats that could be lifted to reveal a compartment for storing mourning clothes or memorial objects. Chapter 12: The Cemetery Movement. The 19th century saw a revolution in how the dead were buried and remembered. The old churchyards, crowded and unsanitary, gave way to a new kind of burial ground, the garden cemetery. The first of these was Père Lachaise in Paris, opened in 1804. It was followed by Mount Auburn in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in 1831, Laurel Hill in Philadelphia in 1836, and Highgate in London in 1839. These cemeteries were designed as beautiful landscapes, with winding paths, ornamental plantings, and elaborate monuments. They were places for the living as much as the dead, places for picnics, for walks, for contemplation. The rural cemetery movement transformed memento mori from private contemplation into public experience. People visited cemeteries on weekends, strolling among the graves, reading the epitaphs, reflecting on mortality. Guidebooks were published, tours were conducted, death became a destination. Highgate Cemetery in London became particularly famous. Its Egyptian avenue, with massive stone columns and dark passages, was designed to evoke ancient tombs. The Circle of Lebanon, with its central cedar tree surrounded by vaults, created a space of haunting beauty. And the cemetery's most famous resident, Karl Marx, would draw pilgrims for generations. The new cemeteries also revived the art of the epitaph. For centuries, most graves had been marked with simple stones bearing only names and dates. Now, families competed to create the most moving, the most poetic, the most memorable inscriptions. Some were simple and direct. Remember, friend, as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you shall be. Prepare for death and follow me. Others were more elaborate, drawing on poetry, scripture, and classical literature. Some were even humorous, at least by Victorian standards. A stone for a blacksmith read, "My hammer lies rusting, my forge is grown cold, my anvil is buried, my bellows won't blow." The most famous epitaph of the era appears on the tomb of William Shakespeare, though it was written much earlier. "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." Chapter 13: Spiritualism and the Denial of Death. Yet even as Victorian death culture reached its peak, a counter-movement was emerging. Spiritualism, the belief that the dead could communicate with the living, offered a way to overcome death, to pierce the veil between worlds. Spiritualism began in 1848 in Hydesville, New York, with the Fox sisters, Maggie, Kate, and Leah. The sisters claimed to communicate with the spirit through rapping sounds, developing a code of knocks to answer questions. Word spread rapidly, and soon the sisters were conducting public seances. The movement exploded. By the 1850s, spiritualism had millions of followers in America and Europe. It attracted intellectuals, artists, and ordinary people desperate for contact with lost loved ones. It offered something traditional religion could not: direct personal communication with the dead. Seances became a popular form of entertainment as well as spiritual practice. Mediums would enter trances, produce messages from the dead, cause objects to move, and materialize spirit forms. Some of these were obvious frauds, but many people believed sincerely. Spirit photography emerged as a related phenomenon. Photographers claimed to capture images of the dead alongside the living. These photographs often showed faint, ghostly figures hovering behind or beside the sitter. Some were deliberate frauds, using double exposure or composite printing. Others may have been genuine attempts to capture something beyond normal vision. The most famous spirit photographer was William Mumler, who operated in Boston and New York in the 1860s and 1870s. His most renowned photograph shows Mary Todd Lincoln with the ghost of her husband Abraham Lincoln standing behind her. Mumler was eventually tried for fraud but acquitted, as many of his clients testified to their belief in his work. Spiritualism represented a fundamental shift in the human relationship with death. For thousands of years, Memento Mori had accepted death as the end, or at least as a transition to a state beyond human contact. Spiritualism promised something different: continued relationship, ongoing communication, the possibility of advice and comfort from beyond. This was, in a sense, the opposite of Memento Mori. Instead of accepting death's finality, spiritualism denied it. Instead of preparing for death, it sought to overcome it. The dead were not gone, they were simply in another room, waiting to speak. Spiritualism never entirely replaced traditional memento mori practices, but it offered an alternative that would grow increasingly appealing as the 20th century approached. The Victorians had taken memento mori to its extreme, surrounding themselves with death in every possible form. Yet even as they did so, they were planting the seeds of a new relationship with mortality, one that would seek to hide, deny, and overcome death, rather than embrace it. Act 5. The Modern Era. Circa 1900 of the Common Era through present. Chapter 14. Death Goes Underground. The 20th century transformed the human relationship with death more dramatically than any previous era. The changes were so profound that some historians have called it the disappearance of death. World War I was the catalyst. The war killed approximately 20 million people, many of them young men in the prime of life. It introduced industrial warfare, machine guns, poison gas, artillery barrages that could annihilate entire regiments in minutes, and it created a problem unprecedented in human history: what to do with so many dead. The old Victorian death culture could not accommodate this. There were too many bodies, too much grief, too much horror. The elaborate mourning rituals, the hair jewelry, the long periods of public grief, all of these were impossible when death came in such quantities. The war also changed where and how people died. The Victorian ideal was the good death at home, surrounded by family, conscious and prepared. But soldiers died far from home, often alone, often violently, often without the chance for last words or final sacraments. Their bodies were often never recovered, or buried in mass graves, or identified only by dog tags. This created a new kind of grief, a grief without closure, without a body to mourn, without a grave to visit. The war cemeteries that sprang up across Europe were attempts to address this, to give families somewhere to grieve. But they could not replace the domestic deathbed that had been the center of Victorian mourning. As death moved out of the home, it moved into the funeral parlor. The modern funeral industry emerged in the early 20th century, professionalizing and commercializing the care of the dead. Embalming, which had been rare before the American Civil War, became standard. Funeral homes replaced home viewings. Professional morticians took over tasks that families had once performed themselves. Death became a service to be purchased rather than an experience to be lived through. Jessica Mitford's 1963 book, The American Way of Death, exposed this industry in devastating detail. She described the pressure to purchase expensive caskets, the euphemistic language, loved one, slumber room, final resting place, the exploitation of grief for profit. The funeral industry, she argued, had succeeded in making death both invisible and expensive. By mid-century, most deaths in the developed world occurred in hospitals rather than homes. This was partly due to medical advances. Hospitals could now do things that were not possible before. But it also reflected a cultural shift. Death was increasingly seen as a medical failure, something to be fought and postponed rather than accepted and prepared for. The hospital death was different from the home death. It was clinical, sterile, surrounded by machines and professionals rather than family. The dying person was often sedated, isolated, removed from the normal rhythms of life. The elaborate Victorian rituals of deathbed preparation, prayers, last words, final blessings, became impossible. In 1973, anthropologist Ernest Becker published The Denial of Death, which won the Pulitzer Prize and became one of the most influential books of the century. Becker argued that human civilization is fundamentally a response to the terror of death. Humans build cultures, create art, achieve greatness, all to convince themselves that they matter, that they will be remembered, that death is not the end. But modern society, Becker argued, had taken denial to new extremes. Death had been removed from daily life, hidden in hospitals and funeral homes, surrounded by euphemism and evasion. Society had, in effect, tried to pretend death did not exist. This denial had consequences. Without the constant reminder of mortality, people lost perspective. They pursued trivial goals, accumulated meaningless wealth, obsessed over minor slights. They lived as if they had forever, and in doing so, they failed to live fully. Becker's book sparked renewed interest in death awareness. It suggested that the old memento mori tradition was not morbid. It was essential. Death needed to be remembered, not to cause depression, but to enable full engagement with life. Chapter 15. The Memento Mori Revival. The late 20th and early 21st centuries have witnessed a remarkable revival of interest in memento mori. After a century of denial, death is returning to public consciousness. The acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, epidemic of the 1980s and 1990s forced death back into public awareness. Here was a disease that killed young people, that was stigmatized, that could not be hidden. The acquired immune deficiency syndrome crisis produced its own art, its own activism, its own rituals of mourning. The NAMES Project Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome Memorial Quilt, begun in 1987, became the largest community art project in history, a massive, ever-expanding memento mori for a generation lost too soon. In the 2010s, a new movement emerged, the death positive movement. Led by figures such as mortician Caitlin Doughty, author of Smoke Gets in Your Eyes and creator of the Ask a Mortician YouTube series, this movement seeks to break the taboo around death and reintegrate it into everyday life. Doughty and others advocate for home funerals, green burials, death cafes, and open conversations about mortality. They are not attempting to resurrect Victorian mourning practices, but to create new ways of engaging with death that are honest, personal, and meaningful. The movement has gained remarkable traction. Death cafes, gatherings where people discuss death over tea and cake, have spread to dozens of countries. Green burials, which avoid embalming and use biodegradable materials, are growing in popularity. The funeral industry is being challenged by new models and new attitudes. The internet has created new forms of memento mori. Social media accounts of the deceased become digital memorials, frozen in time, visited by friends and strangers. Rest in peace comments accumulate. Profile pictures become ghostly presences. Some artists have explored digital memento mori consciously. The website We Croak sends users 5 death reminders daily, based on the Bhutanese belief that contemplating death 5 times each day leads to happiness. The app shows a simple image and the words, "Don't forget, you're going to die." This is memento mori for the smartphone age. Chapter 16. Contemporary Expressions. Today, memento mori appears in countless forms, from high art to popular culture. Contemporary artists continue to explore mortality. Damien Hirst's work, particularly his series of animal corpses preserved in formaldehyde, directly confronts death. His 1991 piece, The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living, a tiger shark in a tank, forces viewers to face what they would rather avoid. Other artists take gentler approaches. The Ashes to Art movement turns cremains into glass sculptures or mixes them into paint for portraits. These are memento mori objects for the 21st century, personal, beautiful, permanent. Memento mori has returned to fashion. Alexander McQueen's collections often featured skull motifs. Jewelry designers create contemporary versions of Victorian mourning jewelry. The skull has become a fashion statement, stripped of its original meaning, but still carrying echoes of mortality. Memento mori tattoos are increasingly popular. Skulls, hourglasses, candles, and inscriptions remind the wearer, and all who see them, of death's inevitability. Some people receive tattoos of their own epitaphs. Others get portraits of deceased loved ones. The tattoo becomes a permanent memento mori carried on the body. Popular music has always addressed death, but contemporary artists explore it more directly. David Bowie's final album, Black Star, released 2 days before his death, is a sustained meditation on mortality. Leonard Cohen's You Want It Darker, released just weeks before his death, confronts death with unflinching honesty. Contemporary literature continues the memento mori tradition. Julian Barnes's Nothing to be Frightened of is a memoir of mortality. Atul Gawande's Being Mortal examines how medicine has failed to help people die well. Paul Kalanithi's When Breath Becomes Air, written as he was dying of cancer, is a modern classic of death-facing literature. Chapter 17. The Psychology of Remembering Death. Recent psychological research has confirmed what the ancients knew. Contemplating death can improve life. In the 1980s, psychologists developed terror management theory based on Becker's work. The theory suggests that humans manage the terror of death by building cultural worldviews that give life meaning and by seeking self-esteem that makes them feel like valuable members of that culture. The most interesting finding concerns what happens when people are reminded of death. Hundreds of studies have shown that mortality salience, bringing death to mind, produces predictable effects. People become more patriotic, more religious, more attached to their cultural worldviews. They become more generous toward those who share their values and more hostile toward those who do not. Other studies have found different effects. When people are reminded of death in a way that does not trigger defensiveness, through gentle contemplation rather than threat, they often become more compassionate, more appreciative of life, more focused on intrinsic values. The quality of the reminder matters significantly. Scandinavian countries report some of the lowest death anxiety in the world. Researchers attribute this to cultural factors: open discussion of death, practical preparation. Many Scandinavians keep their own coffins in their homes, and a cultural emphasis on living well in the present. Norway even has a word for the memento mori feeling: dødsbevissthet, death consciousness. It is regarded as a positive quality, a source of wisdom and perspective. The mindfulness movement has rediscovered the ancient connection between death awareness and full living. Many mindfulness teachers incorporate death contemplation into their practice. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist teacher, advises, "Thanks to death, we are able to live. Contemplate death to learn how to live well." The growing popularity of mindfulness suggests a hunger for the kind of perspective that Memento Mori provides. In a world of constant distraction and trivial concerns, the reminder of death offers a way to focus on what matters. Act 6. Conclusion. Chapter 18. The Eternal Return. This journey has traversed vast territory, from Egyptian banquets with servants carrying wooden coffins, to Roman triumphs with slaves whispering in generals' ears, to medieval monasteries with monks sleeping in their own graves, to Renaissance paintings with hidden skulls, to Victorian parlors with hair jewelry and post-mortem photographs, to contemporary apps that ping users 5 times daily with death reminders. Through all these transformations, the core insight remains constant. Memento mori, remember you must die, is not a morbid slogan, but a liberating truth. It is the key to living fully, loving deeply, and leaving nothing important unsaid or undone. The reason memento mori has persisted for thousands of years, across countless cultures and transformations, is simple. It is true, and it helps. All will die. Every person loved will die. Everything built will crumble. This is not a cause for despair, but a reason to pay attention. When death is forgotten, time is wasted on trivialities. Grudges are held. Joy is postponed. The illusion of forever prevails. When death is remembered, perspective is gained. Forgiveness comes more easily. Love is expressed more often. The perfect moment is not awaited. This moment is lived. The great paradox of memento mori is that by accepting death, life becomes more fully alive. The skeleton at the feast does not ruin the party, it makes the party matter. The skull on the desk does not depress the writer, it focuses the mind on what needs to be said. Seneca understood this 2,000 years ago. Let us prepare our minds as if we had come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's accounts every day. Marcus Aurelius understood it. You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. The Victorian mother who had her dead child photographed understood it. This love, this loss, this brief life, it all matters because it ends. How might memento mori be practiced today? Not necessarily by digging graves or wearing skull jewelry, though one might if inclined, but by finding ways to remember, daily, that time is limited. Some set phone reminders. Others meditate on death. Others make it a practice to imagine, when saying goodbye to loved ones, that it might be the last time. Others write their own epitaphs or plan their own funerals. The specific practice matters less than the intention. To live with death in view, to let mortality inform mortality, to let the end shape the middle. There is a story about the Buddha that captures this perfectly. A woman came to him with her dead child, begging him to restore the child to life. The Buddha said he would, if she could bring him a mustard seed from a household that had never known death. The woman went from house to house, and in every house she found that death had visited. Her search became a memento mori pilgrimage, and in the end she understood. She returned to the Buddha without the mustard seed, but with something more valuable: acceptance. She buried her child, and became a follower of the path. The story is not about giving up, it is about waking up. The ubiquity of death, once truly seen, becomes the basis for compassion, for presence, for fully engaged life. That is what Memento Mori offers: not fear, not morbidity, not despair, only clarity, only perspective, only the truth. We are here for a while, and then we are not. And because of that, every moment matters. Memento Mori. Remember that you will die. Now go live. Appendix: Memento Mori across cultures. The Buddhist practice of Maranasati, mindfulness of death, includes contemplation of the body's decay, reflection on death's inevitability, and meditation on the uncertainty of death's timing. Monks are encouraged to meditate in charnel grounds, surrounded by decomposing bodies. In Tibetan Buddhism, the Chod practice involves visualizing offering one's body to demons, a radical confrontation with attachment to the physical self. The Mexican Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, celebrates the continued presence of ancestors. Skeletons and skulls appear everywhere, in food, in art, in costumes. But the mood is joyful, not grim. The Japanese concept of mono no aware, the pathos of things, recognizes beauty in impermanence. Cherry blossoms are treasured precisely because they fall so quickly. The Prophet Muhammad advised, "Remember often the destroyer of pleasures," meaning death. Islamic graves are often simple, with the grave itself sometimes left slightly uneven to remind visitors of death's reality. Jewish tradition includes visiting graves, reciting memorial prayers, and the concept of yizkor, remembrance. The phrase Hamakom Yenachem Echem Betoch Shar Avalei Tzion V'Yerushalayim, may God comfort you among the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem, acknowledges death while affirming community. Selected Memento Mori inscriptions.
As you are, I once was. As I am, so you will be. Common on ancient Roman tombs.
What you are, we were. What we are, you will be. Common in medieval cemeteries.
Remember death and never sin. Saint Jerome.
I was not. I was. I am not. I care not. Common on Greek and Roman graves.
Live mindful of death. Stoic maxim.
Death laughs at all things but virtue. Traditional. The remembrance of death is a spur in the side of the living. Thomas Fuller. Death is the mother of beauty. Wallace Stevens.
So live that you may always wish to have lived long and never fear to die. Epicurus.
In the midst of life, we are in death. Book of Common Prayer. This completes the journey through the complete history of Memento Mori, from ancient Egypt to the smartphone age, from philosophical concept to cultural practice, from fear of death to celebration of life.